The cigarette trembled in his hand. She noticed that. Not the spurs, not the boots caked in Pacific mud, not even the hat perched carelessly on his head like he was playing dress-up in a war zone. It was the cigarette, shaking, as he leaned closer to a girl no one was supposed to look at twice. She sat on the floor, knees pulled to her chest, hair matted, eyes downcast, trained like all the others to vanish in plain sight. She was property. She was shame. She was silence. And yet he knelt. She braced for the touch, rough, wordless, American, but it never came. Instead, he offered something absurd, a name. "What's yours?" he asked. She flinched, not at the voice, but at the question. No man had asked that since she was taken, and so began something so improbable it would travel like rumor, like heresy, like hope. Before she was a number, before she was a whisper behind a curtain, she was a girl who loved to hum while picking daikon from the garden. Her name was Now, and she was 15 the last time the sun touched her bare arms without the weight of shame. Her village lay in the green folds of central Japan, where cicadas sang louder than radios, and neighbors handed each other bowls of rice without keeping count. Her mother wore her hair in a long braid, her father smelled of tobacco and ink. Now carried water from the well each morning, barefoot on the cool dirt path, humming the lullaby her grandmother used to sing during thunderstorms. Life was not easy, but it was patterned, predictable in the way rain came and went, in the way her father nodded silently when the rice came out right. She thought that was peace. Then, one day, men in uniform came. They arrived with smiles first, then papers. They praised her family's loyalty to the emperor. They promised training, medicine, a monthly wage. "Women of service," they called it. "Vital to morale." Her father hesitated. Her mother asked questions, but the recruiter was patient. He showed a booklet with pictures of clean rooms and nurses in pressed uniforms. "Now is bright," he said. "She can help our soldiers. Our country needs her." The word honor came up often. So did patriotism. That night, her mother packed her a small bundle with an extra kimono, some dried persimmons, and a letter. Nayo thought she was leaving for something noble. When the truck pulled away, she waved until her mother was only a blur behind the dust. The trip was long. Days blurred into one another, and the girls in the truck, there were maybe 20, spoke in low voices. Some wept. Others stared ahead. One girl, older, whispered that she had done this before. Nayo didn't understand what she meant. She thought she was headed to a hospital. Instead, they arrived at a building with thick concrete walls and metal doors that clicked shut with too much finality. A man handed her a clipboard. She signed where he pointed. Then he took the letter from her mother and threw it into a bin. "No need for personal items," he said in clipped Japanese. "You are not a civilian anymore." They shaved her hair. Not completely, but enough to make her scalp feel naked. They deloused her with powder that stung her skin. They gave her a thin robe and numbered her file. From that day forward, she was Comfort Woman number 2387. No rank, no birthday, no family, just a room with a cot, a steel bucket, and a small shelf with gauze and disinfectant. The training began the next day, not in healing, but in silence. A woman in a stiff uniform told them what to expect. How many soldiers per day, how to keep from getting pregnant, how to bite their tongues when it hurt. "You are tools," she said flatly. "You are not wives, you are not girls, you are here to serve." If someone cried, she was slapped. If someone spoke, she was punished. Now did neither. She sat perfectly still, her knees tucked beneath her, remembering how her grandmother used to say, Still water cuts deepest. It became her armor. The first soldier who entered her room was drunk. He didn't ask for her name. None of them did. Afterward, she cleaned the sheets with trembling hands. Blood, sweat, alcohol. The smell would linger for days. She wasn't allowed to bathe more than once a week. Each time she tried to hum, she bit her lip to stop herself. The stations moved as the front lines shifted. China, the Philippines, Burma. The girls traveled in silence, shadows behind the war machine. Some disappeared, taken away when they got sick or refused to open their doors. Now stopped asking where they went. Her body became something separate from her, a thing that endured. She memorized the cracks in each ceiling, the way soldiers whistled before they entered, the weight of each door slam. She learned to smile just enough, to look down, to breathe shallow. Somewhere along the line she stopped counting the men, but she never forgot the humming. And when she found herself in Luzon, in a dim corridor outside a crumbling outpost, the war sounded close, too close. The officers were panicked. The girls were left locked inside, waiting for the boots of liberation or slaughter. Either way, it would be a different kind of silence. Then came the sound of footsteps, softer than usual. Boots, but not like the others. She looked up and saw a cowboy. His boots were scuffed and stained with a color that wasn't just mud. His helmet hung too loose over a shock of sandy hair, and his sleeves were rolled up high enough to reveal a forearm lined with sunburn and dust. Most soldiers marched like steel, rigid and purposeful, but this one ambled as if he were still walking fence lines back in Amarillo. The girls watched from behind the slats of their bamboo pens, too broken to be curious, all except one who raised her head ever so slightly at the sight of his shadow. Back home they called him Dusty, not because of his name, but because of the way he never seemed to clean the red clay from his boots after riding. Before the draft, he had been a ranch hand, a barrel racer, a boy who could rope steer before he could drive a truck. He was 19 when he left Texas, 20 when he got shipped to the Philippines, and somewhere between the two, he forgot how to sleep without hearing explosions. Dusty never believed in glory. When the recruiter asked him why he wanted to fight, he said, "I don't." They took him anyway, said his hands were strong and his aim was clean. But his heart wasn't in it. He didn't hate the Japanese. He hated what the war had done to his brother, who came home from North Africa with a limp and eyes that never blinked at the sound of thunder. In Luzon, the heat clung to the men like grief. It seeped into their uniforms, into their bones. Dusty kept to himself, played his guitar when he could, mostly old country ballads no one else recognized. He sang them soft, under his breath, like prayers to a god he wasn't sure listened anymore. By the time his unit rolled up on the garrison near the river, the fighting was thin, but the tension thick. They expected resistance. They found rot. The outpost was half collapsed, swarming with flies and the stench of something long dead. Inside the barracks were girls, dozens, some barely older than Dusty's cousin back in Lubbock. Most didn't look up. They were barefoot, bruised, lined in rows behind bamboo partitions like livestock. A few clutched rags to their chests. One coughed so hard she doubled over. The commanding officer took one look and said, "Comfort, girls, leave 'em." Military detritus. That's what they called them, as if war left behind its own kind of garbage. Dusty didn't move, couldn't. He felt the bile rise in his throat as the other men stepped over bodies and broken crates. He kept looking at their faces, or what was left of them. Then something stopped him cold, a sound, soft, fragile, humming, not a scream, not a plea, a melody, just 4 or 5 notes, half-broken, sung by someone whose voice had nearly forgotten how to rise. He turned, slowly. toward the sound, and there she was, hair hanging over her eyes, lips barely parted, tracing the shape of a lullaby he hadn't heard in years. It was his lullaby. His mama used to sing it when the storms came loud over the plains. Shenandoah, in a Japanese tongue, barely recognizable but still unmistakable. The air went out of him. He stepped toward her, and a guard barked something in English. "Don't engage." Dusty kept walking. His feet moved like they weren't his. She stopped humming. Her eyes locked onto his. Not with hope, not with fear, but with the dull anticipation of another order, another hand. Instead, he crouched. He took off his helmet. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a matchbook, then a crumpled stick of gum. Not an offering, just something human. He didn't ask her name, not yet. He just said, "You hungry?" She stared at him. Then, as if unsure whether this was a trick or a hallucination, she nodded. Dusty didn't blink. He stood, turned on his heel, and walked straight back through the mud and silence, past the other men who watched him like he'd gone mad. He wasn't sure what he'd just seen, only that it had changed him, and he couldn't look away. The next morning, Dusty returned with a slice of bread hidden in his helmet liner. It was stale, but soft enough to tear. He didn't hand it to her directly, just placed it beside the bamboo slats while pretending to adjust his boot. She didn't move, didn't blink, only stared with that same half-dead quietness. When he came back that evening, the bread was gone, but she hadn't run. That was something. The other men noticed. They laughed at him. "You sweet on her, Texas?" One of them jeered, spitting tobacco into the dirt. "She's just leftover soup. You gonna marry her next?" Dusty didn't respond. He kept cleaning his rifle, quiet, unbothered. But inside, something was shifting, a kind of anger that didn't yell, just smoldered. Each day he brought something, a slice of orange, a folded napkin. Once, a tiny bar of soap he'd pocketed from the officers' quarters. He never lingered, never touched her, never asked for anything, just left these small offerings like seeds and waited to see if they'd grow. Now didn't speak, not at first. She had learned that silence was safer than gratitude, that words only invited punishment. In the comfort stations, kindness was a trick, a precursor to cruelty. So she sat still when he approached. She looked away when he crouched near the pen. But her hands betrayed her. When no one watched, she ate the food, held the soap, and once, when she thought no one saw, she smelled it, deeply, with her eyes closed. One afternoon, Dusty found a mark in the dirt, a drawing, just a rough sketch made with a fingertip, a tiny house, crooked fence, a chicken. He stared at it for a long time, his heart thudding. "You live on a farm?" he asked softly. She didn't answer, but the next day another picture appeared, a woman with a braid, long and thick. Dusty guessed it was her mother. "I miss mine, too," he said. Still nothing. But something had changed. The pictures kept coming, a river, a cloud, a plum tree. She was speaking without words. Dusty brought her a pencil stub and a crumpled sheet of notebook paper. She took them without meeting his eyes, but that night she slept with the pencil wrapped in cloth beside her pillow. The guards had stopped trying to stop him. Some thought it was funny. Others just didn't care. "Let the cowboy waste his time," they muttered. "Better than drinking." But Dusty didn't care what they thought. He wasn't doing it for them. He didn't know what he was doing it for, really. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was the way she held her body like it didn't belong to her anymore. Or maybe it was the way her eyes, when she did glance at him, looked like they remembered music. One evening, Just as the sky went purple and the air cooled from unbearable to barely livable, Dusty crouched beside her pen again. He didn't bring anything. Just sat. "What's your name?" he asked. He'd asked before, dozens of times. This time, she didn't look away. Her lips moved, barely, like they were testing how sound worked. She whispered something so quietly he thought he imagined it. "Now." Dusty felt his breath catch. He nodded slowly, like hearing it made something sacred. "Now," he repeated. She blinked, startled. Not because he said it wrong, he hadn't, but because he said it like it meant something, like it mattered. In that moment, she wasn't a number, not a body, not a ruin. She was now. And for the first time since the war began, she remembered how that felt. It was a small sound, almost brittle, as if her throat had forgotten how to shape joy. It startled both of them. Dusty looked up from the record player, the needle still dancing over the spinning vinyl, and stared. Now had her hand pressed over her mouth, as if the sound had escaped without permission, but it was there. Laughter, unpolished, unrehearsed. For a heartbeat, it chased the ghosts out of the room. Word had already spread across the outpost like wildfire. The cowboy had gone soft. "Dusty's playing nursemaid," they'd say around the canteen fires. Some just laughed, others spat. "You can't fall for one of them," said one sergeant, his tone laced with disgust. "She ain't a woman, she's a war souvenir." Another, less kind, warned him he'd catch more than a broken heart. Dusty didn't answer. He just kept showing up. Military code was clear, no fraternization. But this wasn't that. Not to him. It wasn't desire. It wasn't romance. It was something harder to define, a stubborn refusal to look away. Every time he looked at Nao, he saw not weakness, but the strongest kind of survival. That terrified people. The propaganda made it easy to hate. Posters showed grinning Japanese soldiers with blood-stained swords, monstrous caricatures that justified napalm and guilt. Comfort girls were barely mentioned, and when they were, it was as enemy collaborators or disease vectors. But Dusty knew better now. These weren't monsters. These were girls who still drew houses in the dirt. He didn't ask permission when he brought the record, just carried it in an old sleeve, tucked into his vest like contraband. The portable phonograph was a beat-up hand-me-down from a French officer who traded it for cigarettes. Dusty wound it up carefully, balancing the tone arm like a glass of water. "Hank Williams?" he said softly, showing her the label. Now didn't know the name, but she watched the reverence in Dusty's eyes as he lowered the needle. The crackle came first, like fire-eating paper, then the voice, low, lonely, almost trembling. "I'm so lonesome I could cry." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the sound. It moved through her like memory, the way his voice strained, like a wound made of sound, the way Dusty closed his eyes, mouthing the lyrics like a prayer. Nio felt her throat tighten. She had been beaten, starved, used, and yet here was this sound, foreign but tender, reaching into places even her language couldn't go. Her shoulders shook. At first Dusty thought she was crying. Then she laughed, once sharp, then again softer. She covered her mouth, embarrassed. Dusty smiled. Not big, just enough. "That's Hank," he whispered. "Back home, we say he sings like he's hurting in slow motion." Now didn't know those words either, but she felt them. That night, the whispers around camp changed pitch. What had been jokes turned sharper. "He's giving her music now?" someone snapped. "Next thing you know, he'll be writing her poems." Dusty didn't respond, but one morning he found his locker had been kicked in, his boots soaked in latrine water. Still, He showed up that evening, same as always, guitar in hand. Now watched him carefully now, less like a ghost, more like someone waking up. She no longer flinched when he said her name. She asked him, haltingly, what a cowboy was. Dusty tried to explain, pantomiming horses, wide fields, rope. She giggled when he mimed falling off. Then, with the pencil he'd given her weeks before, she drew a little stick figure wearing a hat too big for its head. She pointed. "Dusty," she said. He laughed that time. Two sounds, hers and his, meeting like river and rain. In that moment, they weren't soldier and prisoner. They weren't American and Japanese. They were just boy and girl, sitting in the middle of a war neither of them started, sharing the only kind of peace they had left. A song, a drawing, a name. The next morning, she was gone. Dusty woke to the usual clatter of boots and shouted orders, the thick smell of boiled coffee and diesel. But something in the air felt wrong. The bamboo pens were empty, the blankets folded. The girls, all of them, gone. He asked a supply corporal what happened. "Transferred," came the answer, flat as concrete. "Reassigned." As if they were crates of ammunition, as if they hadn't existed at all. He stood there, stunned, staring at the space where she used to sit. The dirt where she had drawn her house was scuffed over, erased by marching boots. Her pencil was gone. So was the record. "Where?" he asked. The man shrugged. "Somewhere south, I think. Or east. Who knows? Command makes those calls." Dusty felt something fall inside him, not fast like a stone, but slow like a tree breaking under its own weight. He didn't yell, didn't curse. He just nodded, then walked to the river and stayed there until sundown, his boots half in the mud, half in the water, watching it pull everything away without care. Back at camp, he went silent. Didn't sing, didn't play. Just did his patrols, cleaned his weapon, counted his rations. The others stopped teasing him. It wasn't fun when he didn't react. They started treating him like a ghost. But he had her name, and that changed everything. He wrote it on the inside of his helmet liner, beneath the sweat-stained leather. Now, in block letters. He whispered it when he chambered around, when he slept, when he saw cherry blossoms floating in the river, far from where they should be. He stopped writing home. His mother wouldn't understand. She'd send Bible verses and pie recipes as if this was still about battles and duty. Then, one evening near the mess tent, he overheard a medic speaking in Japanese to a wounded civilian. The words were soft, clipped, but precise. Dusty waited until the conversation ended, then approached. "You speak it?" The medic nodded cautiously. "Enough to patch people up. Why?" "I need to write something," Dusty said. "To someone." The medic raised a brow. "Enemy intel?" Dusty shook his head. "No, just a name, some words, something I should have said before she left." The medic agreed. Carefully they sat under a tent lamp while Dusty dictated, phrase by phrase. He didn't try to explain the war or apologize for it. He didn't pretend they would see each other again. He just wrote about the way she laughed, about the drawing she made, about how she'd given him back something he didn't know he'd lost, his own name, in a way. At the end, he asked the medic how to write, "You are not forgotten." When it was done, he folded the page and placed it in an envelope. He didn't know where to send it. There was no address, but he kept it tucked in the breast pocket of his uniform, over his heart, sealed and waiting. That night, for the first time in weeks, he dreamed again. Not of firefights or marching orders, but of a small house drawn in the dirt, a woman with a braid, and the sound of a Hank Williams song echoing across a field of tall grass. He woke with her name on his lips, and though she was gone, he refused to let the silence swallow her. Now. She was not forgotten. But remembering someone is not the same as finding them. Dusty knew that. Still, he clung to the envelope in his pocket like it was a map. The war was sputtering to its exhausted end. The papers said victory, but the world still felt like a wound that hadn't scabbed. Troops were packing up, trucks loaded with gear and ghosts. The lucky ones got orders home. The rest stayed behind to sweep out the rubble. Dusty stayed. He volunteered for cleanup, filing, inventory, anything that kept him close, just in case. The letter became part of him. Folded, refolded, the edges soft from his thumb. He didn't know what he expected, but one day, over cold potatoes in the mess tent, he overheard a Red Cross nurse say they were collecting names. Displaced persons, mostly women, many from comfort stations. Some had been found in caves, others in barns, carried out on stretchers like forgotten pages of a burned book. Dusty stood up, walked straight to her, and handed her the letter. He didn't say much, just pointed to the name. "Please," he said, "if she's out there." The nurse took it, studied his face, and nodded. It was out of his hands now. The letter traveled like a whisper against wind. From the Red Cross to a field office in Lingayen, then by jeep convoy to a British interpreter stationed at an Allied processing center near Manila. He was the kind of man who usually tossed such things. Love letters had become as common as lice. But something about the handwriting, the clean square of the envelope, made him pause. He opened it, read the name. Now. 3 days later, while screening new arrivals at a camp for displaced civilians, he read the name again. On a clipboard, scrawled in faded ink beside a photograph. The picture barely looked human. A gaunt woman with a shaved head, eyes sunk deep as river stones. He brought the letter into the open-air tent where the women sat in rows, waiting for food, waiting for news, waiting for anything. He called the name once, then again, a stir, a whisper. One woman stood. Her legs shook. Her hands, wrapped around her elbows, were bone-thin. Her braid was gone. Her face hollowed by months of bad air, worse dreams. But her eyes? They flinched when she heard it. Now. She took the paper like it might burn her, unfolded it slowly. The English meant little. But the shape of the words, the way they curled and leaned, she recognized the rhythm. She traced them with her fingers as if they were a song she used to hum. A translator read it aloud in Japanese, slowly, gently. "You are not shame, you are not ruined, you are now." She didn't cry at first, just blinked. Then, as if the dam had waited exactly for that line, she collapsed. Not from shock, but release, as if some invisible thread had been tugging on her chest for months, years maybe, and now it had been cut. The nurse helped her into a chair. Someone brought water, but now didn't drink. She just held the letter close to her, chest pressed into the fabric of her thin shirt like armor. She whispered his name, not out loud, just the shape of it on her lips. Dusty. For the first time in forever, she let herself believe that someone remembered her not as a number, not as property, not as something broken, but as a person, a girl, a name. Now. She was still now. And somewhere out there, a cowboy had remembered. Weeks passed before it arrived, a small parcel barely thicker than a letter. Dusty recognized the handwriting on the customs stamp before he even opened it. Manila. He sat on the edge of his cot, heart pounding like it was war all over again. Inside was a photograph, black and white, faded at the edges, the kind that looks like it has lived through fire and salt. The woman in the picture stood in front of a canvas tent. She wore a plain dress, her hands folded in front of her like she didn't know what else to do with them. Her eyes stared directly at the lens, wide, still, but no longer broken. She didn't smile, but something stronger lived in that expression. Defiance, maybe, or grace. Dusty didn't show the photo to anyone, not the boys in his unit, not the chaplain. When he finally went home, back to Texas and the sun-bleached cattle roads of his boyhood, he tucked it into the back of his Bible. Behind the page with the Beatitudes, he married not long after, a local girl from Abilene. They had 2 daughters, then a son, a mortgage, dust storms, bills. His wife never asked about the photograph, never knew to. He never wrote to Now again, never tried to find her. Some things, he decided, weren't meant to be lived, only carried. And he carried her, quietly, in the same way one might carry a scar. Not with regret, but with reverence. He became a father, a husband, a neighbor. But some part of him remained back in that field hospital tent, listening to a Japanese girl laugh at his bad cowboy drawings. The photo aged with him. The corners curled, the image blurred, but the eyes, her eyes, stayed sharp in his mind. When his grandson, Luke, turned 15, he helped Dusty clean out an old dresser in the garage. The bottom drawer hadn't been touched in years, a clutter of old maps, rusted belt buckles, and yellowed papers. That's where Luke found it, wrapped in tissue, tied with twine, a photograph and a note. The pencil was faint now, almost erased by time, but the word was still there. Alive. Luke brought it to his grandfather, confused. "Who is she?" Dusty took the photo like it was made of smoke. He stared at it a long time, his thumb brushing the edge, as if smoothing memory back into place. "She was someone I knew," he said finally. "From the war?" Dusty nodded. "From the part no one talks about." He didn't elaborate, just took the photo and slipped it back into his Bible. Later that night, Luke asked his grandmother about the girl. She only shook her head. "He's never told me," she said softly, "but he used to whisper in his sleep. A name, I think, foreign, like a song." That photograph, forgotten in the drawer, became something more than paper. It was a lifeline, a message, a defiance against forgetting. Because history likes to flatten people, to turn names into footnotes, faces into numbers. But Dusty had remembered, and in remembering her, he preserved something sacred, the fact that she had lived, laughed, drawn a house in the dirt, and whispered her name into the silence of war. Now, not just a comfort girl, not just a casualty, a person, a name, alive. The word lingered with her long after the camps emptied, long after the soldiers left, long after the processing tents folded like tired lungs. She carried it back across the sea, tucked inside her blouse, next to the letter that had crossed borders and broken through walls she didn't know she still had. When the ship docked in Yokohama, she stepped onto land that felt both familiar and foreign, the soil the same, but her shadow different. Now returned to Japan quietly, without ceremony, without welcome. Women like her were expected to disappear, and most did, swallowed by shame large enough to drown an entire generation. Her village was gone. Not the land itself, but the life she'd known. The house she remembered, the one she'd drawn in the dirt for Dusty, had been reduced to a stone foundation splintered with moss. Her mother had died during the final winter of the war. Her father had remarried and would not meet her eyes when she arrived at the doorstep, thinner than memory, carrying only a satchel and silence. "Where were you?" he asked. She did not answer, and he did not ask again. Now stayed one night. In the morning she left before sunrise, her father pretending to sleep so he wouldn't have to watch her go. That was the cost of surviving in her country. Silence demanded silence in return. She took the train north, no destination in mind, just movement. She felt safer moving, as if stillness might summon the ghosts she'd spent years trying to outrun. Eventually, she found work cleaning train stations. Before sunrise, she swept platforms, scrubbed benches, washed stairs. Travelers passed her without looking. She preferred it that way. Women like her were written out of stories, out of families, out of history. It was easier to be invisible when the world insisted it of you. But she always kept the letter, folded and refolded so many times it had become soft as cloth, the creases delicate like lace. She kept it in a pocket sewn inside her sleeve, close enough to feel its weight when she lifted her arm. When the cold months settled in, she warmed her hands by holding it between her palms. It wasn't romance she clung to, not the way stories pretend to soften things. She didn't imagine Dusty riding across plains calling her name. That wasn't the point. He had asked for her name, and that alone was an act of rebellion large enough to save something inside her. In a world determined to forget women like her existed, or worse, to insist they had chosen it, Dusty had said her name like it mattered, like she was human, like she had a past worth remembering and a future worth hoping for. Some nights, when the trains were done and the station lights dimmed, she sat on an empty bench, the letter in her lap. She whispered his name, not because she loved him, but because he had given her back the smallest, rarest thing, her own reflection. Just the shape of his name on her lips was enough to soften the hard edges of memory. She never married, not because she couldn't, men asked, some out of pity, some out of loneliness, but because she had carved out a life built on quiet survival, and she trusted it more than she trusted hope. She lived in a boarding room above a shop, tended a small potted plum tree on the windowsill, and saved coins in a jar until she could afford new shoes. Every few years she moved to another town, another station, another set of strangers who wouldn't ask where she'd been. But the letter always traveled with her, tucked inside her sleeve as if sewn into her skin. When she grew older, lines forming around her mouth like parentheses around forgotten words, she still whispered it sometimes. Dusty, just once, softly. Not a lover's call, not a mourning, a reminder. That once, in the middle of a war that tried to erase her, someone had asked, "What's your name?" Someone had listened. If you're moved by this story, give the video a like, and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. It helps more people discover these hidden human histories. By the time she was in her 60s, Now had almost convinced herself it had never happened, that the letter, the drawing in the dirt, the American with the slow voice and kind hands, had been part of some hallucination, some mercy invented by a starving mind. Japan had grown over its wounds like ivy on stone. Skyscrapers bloomed, trains ran on time. But underneath the steel and glass, silence still ruled. She lived alone in a modest apartment above a fish market. Her knees ached, her hands trembled when the rains came. But the letter remained folded in its little sleeve pocket, close to her chest, a relic of a life no one believed she had lived. Then, in the fall of 1991, something changed. A call went out across the country. Researchers were collecting testimonies, brave ones, from women like her. The kind of stories that had been buried beneath shame, national pride, and official denial. Most of the women refused. Some were too broken to speak. Others had died with their secrets intact. Now said yes. She sat across from a young female historian with ink-stained fingers and a tape recorder, and she spoke slowly. Her voice didn't shake. She did not cry. She said, "I was taken. I was numbered. I was used. But one man asked me what my name was. She never said his name, only that he was American, that he was kind, that he gave her bread and a pencil and a song that made her laugh. "He didn't save me," she said. "I saved myself. But he reminded me I existed." The interviewer blinked hard behind her glasses. There was no place in the official archives for a story like this. It didn't fit the narrative of monsters and martyrs, but that made it no less true. In the records, there were no lists of the comfort women's names, no photographs, no forwarding addresses. Entire lives erased with bureaucratic precision. But this was how memory survived, in whispered stories passed down in quiet rooms, in folded letters, in a photograph yellowing behind a Bible page. When the interview was transcribed, Now insisted on one line being included at the end. Not a quote from her, a sentence from the letter. "You are not shame, you are not ruined, you are now." That, she said, was the truth of it all, not the camps, not the cruelty, not the silence that followed, but that someone, somewhere, had said her name and meant it. In the years that followed, more women stepped forward. A movement began to swell, court hearings, apologies, debates. But Nio never returned to the stage. She didn't join protests or file lawsuits. She had told her story once. That was enough. At night, when the city's hum softened and the breeze carried the scent of grilled fish and old rain, she would sometimes sit on her balcony and look at the moon. She'd trace its roundness with her fingertip and imagine a cowboy out there, under the same sky, riding a horse across a field of Texas grass, whispering her name to the stars. Not because he had loved her, but because he had not forgotten. And that, in the end, is what made all the difference. Stories remember what history tries to forget, and now, Comfort Woman, number 2387, had a name worth remembering. We don't know if they ever saw each other again. There's no record of a reunion, no photograph of two old souls standing awkwardly beneath cherry blossoms or beside a dusty cattle fence in Texas. No faded letter saying, "I'm coming." No visa stamps, no headlines, just silence. But perhaps that's the most honest ending there could be. History doesn't often reward tenderness. It catalogues battles, treaties, generals, not a quiet hand passing bread through barbed wire. It doesn't make room for a cowboy who didn't conquer or a girl who was supposed to forget how to sing. And yet the letter survived. So did the photograph. And her name, the one they tried to erase, was remembered, whispered across oceans, carried through decades, and spoken aloud even when no one else was listening. Now, that was the revolution. Not bombs or borders or flags, but one man choosing to ask instead of demand. One girl refusing to let them take the last thing she had, her name. A simple human act repeated across the void of war, across languages, across shame. And in the end, maybe that's all that ever truly survives. There's a power in the unknowable, in the space where the story ends not with answers, but with echoes. Maybe they met again, maybe not. But in a way they had already seen the deepest part of each other, and in that moment, long ago, in the middle of a war that swallowed millions, something sacred had been exchanged. Dusty lived a quiet life, taught his grandkids how to ride horses, fixed fences, went to church on Sundays and tipped well at the diner. But when he grew ill and the days stretched thin, his daughter noticed he often murmured in his sleep, not full sentences, just one word, over and over. Now, she thought it was a dream, maybe a nurse from the war, some lost platoon member. She never asked. When he passed, they found the letter and the photo in the same Bible he had always kept by his bedside. Inside, someone had written a date and the phrase, "Do not forget her." He hadn't. Even when his body gave out, his memory held fast. Because memory, real memory, isn't made of facts and records. It's made of choices. Dusty had made his, to care, to see, to remember. And now, for all the world's efforts to erase her, had endured. Not just as a victim, not just as a number, but as someone whose name had been spoken with reverence, a name that outlived the war, a name that defied history, a name that turned silence into song. So, maybe this story doesn't end with a kiss or a reunion. Maybe it ends with something stronger, the quiet, unstoppable force of dignity. The war tried to break them both, but one asked and one answered, and that was enough. Now, not as a ghost, not as regret, but as a hymn. If this story meant something to you, please like the video and comment where you're watching from. Let's make sure stories like this are never forgotten.